Somebody in the White House thought this would work. Somebody sat in a room, looked at a screen, and said yes. Let us publicly demand that the elected leader of a sovereign G7 nation step down, because he will not do what we want. Somebody approved that. Somebody wrote talking points for it. And somebody looked at 150 to 8 years of Canadian Confederation, and thought the response would be compliance. The response was not compliance. The response was the most coordinated, most surgically devastating diplomatic counterstrike any nation has launched against the United States in the 21st century. And it happened in under 12 hours. Before I walk you through it, I need you to understand the scale of what was attempted here. A sitting American president, using the official channels of the White House, publicly called for the resignation of the democratically elected Prime Minister of Canada. Not in a late-night social media rant. Not through a leaked back-channel message, through a formal statement carried by every wire service on the planet. The statement, released at 7:15 yesterday morning, described Mark Carney as, quote, an obstruction to the natural economic partnership between our two great nations, and called on, quote, the Canadian people to demand leadership that prioritizes cooperation over confrontation. Demand leadership. That is the phrase. The President of the United States told 39 million Canadians to replace their Prime Minister because he was inconvenient to American trade policy. And for about 6 hours, the world held its breath, waiting to see what Canada would do. What Canada did will be studied in diplomatic academies for the next 50 years. At 1:12 in the afternoon Eastern Time, Mark Carney held a press conference. But not alone. Standing behind him were every single living former Prime Minister of Canada. Everyone. Jean Chrétien, Paul Martin, Stephen Harper, Justin Trudeau, Joe Clark, Kim Campbell. 6 former leaders spanning 5 decades and both sides of the political spectrum. 3 liberals. 2 conservatives. 1 who barely lasted 6 months in office. All of them standing shoulder to shoulder behind the current Prime Minister. Harper's presence is the detail that detonates the story. Stephen Harper, the most pro-American, most conservative Prime Minister in modern Canadian history. A man who built his political identity on close alignment with Washington. A man who openly disagreed with Carney on a dozen policy fronts. Standing directly behind him. Arms at his sides. Face like granite. When reporters asked Harper why he was there, he gave a 7-word answer that broke the Canadian internet. Quote, "No foreign leader chooses our Prime Minister." 7 words. Harper did not elaborate. He did not take follow-up questions. He stood there, and let the sentence do its work. The press conference itself was Carney at his most controlled, and most dangerous. He spoke for 11 minutes. No notes. No teleprompter. His voice did not rise once. If you have watched enough of these to know the difference between a politician performing outrage, and a leader channeling cold authority, you know which one this was. Quote, "The Prime Minister of Canada serves at the pleasure of the Canadian Parliament and the Canadian people, not at the pleasure of any foreign government, not today, not tomorrow, not ever. This principle is not negotiable, it is not subject to trade discussions, it is not leverage, it is sovereignty. And sovereignty is the one thing Canada will never put on a table." He paused, and then delivered the line that has been replaying on every news network since. Quote, "Mr. Trump, you do not get to fire me. You are not my boss, you are not Canada's boss. And the sooner you understand that, the sooner we can have the adult conversation these two nations deserve." That was the public response, the visible part. The part designed for cameras and headlines and clips that ricochet around the world in minutes. The private response was worse. For Washington. If you can feel the weight of what just shifted here, subscribe to this channel right now. Because the next layer of this story has not been reported by anyone else yet. Within hours of the press conference, Canada executed a coordinated diplomatic and economic sequence that had clearly been prepared long before Trump's statement gave them the trigger to deploy it. First, Ottawa formally requested an emergency session of the Organization of American States to address what it described as, quote, "an unprecedented attempt by a member state to interfere in the democratic governance of another member state." The OAS Charter explicitly prohibits member nations from intervening in each other's internal political affairs. Canada is forcing a vote that will put the United States on record, defending or explaining why its president publicly demanded the removal of an allied leader. Second, the Canadian ambassador to the United States delivered a formal diplomatic note to the State Department. Diplomatic notes are not letters. They are legal instruments. This one reportedly contained language invoking the Vienna Convention on Diplomatic Relations, and requesting a formal American response to whether the White House statement represents official U.S. policy toward Canadian sovereignty. A diplomatic note requires a diplomatic response. You cannot tweet your way out of it. Third, and this is the economic blade, Canada's finance minister announced an immediate review of all Canadian sovereign wealth holdings in U.S. Treasury securities. Canada holds approximately $73 billion in U.S. government debt. The announcement did not say Canada would sell. It said Canada would review. That distinction matters because in financial markets, a review is a warning shot. It tells bond traders that a $73 billion seller might be entering the market. The mere announcement moved yields. Not dramatically, but enough to get the attention of every fixed-income desk on Wall Street. One diplomatic maneuver to embarrass the U.S. internationally. One legal instrument to force a formal response. One financial signal to remind Washington that economic leverage runs in both directions. All within 12 hours. All clearly pre-planned. All deployed with a precision that makes the White House statement look like what it was. An impulse that ran into a strategy. Now here is where Warren Buffett enters, and makes everything worse for Washington. Buffett was at a private dinner in New York when the Carney press conference aired. According to two attendees who spoke to CNBC, the room went quiet when Harper appeared on screen. Buffett watched the entire 11 minutes without comment. When it ended, someone asked him what he thought. Quote, "That is what institutional depth looks like. 6 former leaders, 3 political parties, 1 message. Show me an American president who could assemble that kind of unified front from his predecessors right now. You cannot. Because we do not have that anymore. Canada just showed us what we have lost." Later, in a more formal setting, Buffett expanded on the economic implications. Quote, "You do not publicly demand that the leader of your largest trading partner resign and then expect the trading relationship to continue normally. Every Canadian business owner, every Canadian investor, every Canadian pension fund manager just heard the American president say their government is illegitimate. How do you think they respond? They diversify. They reduce American exposure, they find other partners, not because of ideology, because of risk management. You just made America a risk." Then came the observation that traders are still dissecting. Quote, "I have been watching capital flows for nearly 70 years. When a government becomes unpredictable toward its own allies, capital does not wait for the situation to resolve. It moves, slowly at first, then all at once." The statement this morning did not just offend Canada, it told every allied nation holding American assets that those assets come with political conditions they did not agree to. Drop a like on this video if you want the algorithm to push this kind of analysis to people who need to see it. One tap. That is all it takes. The global response has been swift and almost uniformly aligned against Washington. The European Union issued a statement calling the resignation demand, quote, "incompatible with the principles governing relations between democratic nations." France's president said publicly that Canada's sovereignty, quote, "is not a subject for negotiation by any external power." Japan's foreign ministry issued a rare unprompted statement supporting, quote, "the inviolable right of democratic nations to determine their own leadership." And here is the layer beneath the statements. Every single one of those nations is doing exactly what Buffett described, quietly reassessing their exposure to American political volatility. If the American president can publicly try to remove the leader of Canada, what boundary actually exists? What prevents the same pressure from being applied to a European leader, who blocks an American trade demand? To an Asian ally who declines a military request? The answer, as of yesterday, is nothing. No boundary held. And every capital noticed. 3 ways this unfolds from here. First, the quick burial. The White House reframes the statement as rhetorical frustration, not formal policy. Backchannels reopen. Carney accepts the de-escalation without requiring a public apology he knows he would never get. The OAS session quietly gets postponed. Treasury review gets shelved. Things normalize on the surface, while the structural trust damage compounds underneath. Second, the diplomatic freeze. Neither side backs down publicly. The OAS session proceeds. The diplomatic note remains unanswered. Trade negotiations halt entirely. The bilateral relationship enters a cold period lasting months, during which Canadian trade diversification accelerates dramatically, and American border state economies absorb mounting losses. I believe this is the most likely near-term path because neither leader has incentive to blink first. Third, the precedent cascade. Other nations see Canada's response as a successful template for resisting American pressure. The OAS vote creates a formal record. Allied nations begin coordinating diplomatic and economic responses to American unilateralism. The Western alliance does not collapse but reorganizes into a structure where the United States is one powerful member among several, rather than the unquestioned leader. This is a multi-year trajectory, but the seeds were planted yesterday. Here is what I keep turning over. There are only a handful of moments in diplomatic history where a single statement by a single leader fundamentally altered how the rest of the world calculates its relationship with a great power. This was one of them. Not because of what Trump said, but because of what Canada proved in response. Canada proved that a mid-sized democracy, when pushed to the wall, can mobilize institutional unity, diplomatic architecture, and economic leverage fast enough and precisely enough to turn an attack into a liability for the attacker. And every country watching just learned that the playbook works. Subscribe and hit notifications. The OAS session has not happened yet. The diplomatic note has not been answered. The Treasury review is still pending. This story has a second act, and a third, and we will be breaking down every one of them. Stephen Harper stood behind Mark Carney yesterday, a conservative behind a liberal, a rival behind a competitor, and when asked why he said 7 words that landed heavier than anything Washington produced all day. No foreign leader chooses our prime minister. That sentence is now carved into the diplomatic record, and no amount of tweets will sand it off.